Branching dialogue systems are everywhere in video games. Even your mom has one now. And you might be wondering, how do I make one of those? Then I'd say, I don't fucking know. It depends on what the rest of your game is, what tools you're using, and what your priorities are. In our case, we're making a mini sandbox RPG in Godot game engine called Spaceborne, where you're stuck in a generational spaceship. And I just made a branching dialogue system for it. You can pick unique options, show different lines, and the conversations can even affect different things in the game world. I actually put implementing branching dialogue off for a while because for some reason I just had a hard time wrapping my head around how to make this in a clean and systemic way. Stick around to see how we made our dialogue system and what things to consider when picking methodology. We actually already have a dialogue system, but it's topics based, which means you have a persistent list of keywords you can ask any NPC about, and the conversations are freeform and systems driven. That's the primary mode of dialogue for our game, but for key story moments I wanted to have branching tree events that function like the dialogue in other RPGs. This will let the player express their character through choices and let us, the developers, do conventional storytelling. What's tough is that the branching logic of each unique conversation is the data that needs to be stored and loaded dynamically, which is pretty unusual. There's a lot of dialogue plugins for Godot that can help you script these things out quickly, but none of them were quite what we wanted for our game. And since this is a long-term project with no particular deadline, the value of making something that's just right for us outweighs the value of having something quick. And making stuff ourselves is fun. There are a few unique requirements we knew from the start. We wanted the branching dialogue to be in its own menu with the same silhouette as the main dialogue menu, so that we can layer it on top whenever we want and it will just look like the buttons have been replaced. We also needed the system to essentially be a loop of displaying an NPC line, creating buttons for that line's response options, clearing the lines and buttons when an option is selected, and then looping back to the top. Additionally, we technically don't want a tree structure, although we'll be using the term colloquially. You see, a tree structure is defined by strict parent-child relationships. One twig can't come from two branches, but we want branches to be able to loop in on themselves or converge, so we actually needed a free-form interconnected node system. Luckily, Godot 3 has a visual scripting language that I've never actually used before that functions off of interconnected nodes. Branching logic is one of the only things that visual coding does better than standard text coding, but I quickly realized this didn't solve all of our problems, because it turns out that that loop I described earlier is one of those things that gets really annoying to make when you're working in a real-time engine. Like every time we display a line, it needs to pause and wait for input, which is easy enough, but how do we stop and then remember where we were in the conversation function when we loop back to it the next frame? We needed a way to pause and restart a function. And then I remember this thing called a coroutine, which is literally that. Why haven't I been using these more? The principle of how this dialogue system works is that the dialogue menu has a text script that handles the basic functionality, but then there's a visual script that contains a coroutine function for each unique conversation. These two scripts work together and communicate back and forth to run the branching dialogue. Here's the setup we came up with. The visual script is set as an autoload, which means it's like its own object that can be accessed globally. The menu calls a conversation coroutine from it, and then in the conversation coroutine, each time a line is shown, we call yield, which pauses the conversation and returns a handle to itself back to the menu script. Then whenever a dialogue option is picked, the menu just calls resume on said handle, and the conversation picks up where it left off until the next yield function is called or the end of the conversation is reached. But for some reason it just wasn't doing anything when I press the option buttons. Turns out that Godot's visual scripting doesn't have shit in terms of debug features. No breakpoints, not a lot of documentation. Look at this. I just want to print text to the output window, but how do I set the text for this node? Can we construct a string? What the fuck is this? I thought visual scripting was supposed to be easy or something. Turned out that yield wasn't returning a valid handle, but we did everything right on our side, so in lieu of more information, it's likely an engine bug. But there's an alternative yield function in Godot's visual scripting language that waits for a signal. So we tried making a custom signal for resuming the conversation, but for some reason the visual script just wouldn't recognize custom signals. So we did a little hack where we just misappropriated a built-in signal that we knew would never get used, and for some reason it worked. Here's the working setup. When we want to display a line and update the dialogue options, the conversation calls this function from the menu script. Then it waits for this arbitrary signal to be emitted from the menu. This returns control to the menu's update function, which just checks each frame if the dialogue option was picked. When one is picked, it lets the conversation script know which option was picked, and then it emits a signal, letting the conversation resume. Did you know Godot 4 isn't going to have visual scripting? I wonder why. Now this was just the system in isolation. There was still half the battle of getting it fully integrated into the game. We started by making the menu script use an array of function references to run the conversation functions, with a system of unique names for each conversation. That way we can give the menu the name of the conversation we want and we'll be able to run it. We might switch to an ID system or maybe just use each conversation's index in the array directly. We'll see. Here's a preview of the same test convo in the actual game. Before we go on, you're going to need to know a little about how the dialogue in Spaceborne works. The player has a list of topics that they can ask any NPC about, and each NPC has a list of responses to each topic. We use spreadsheets to make these lists, and export them into tab-separated text files for the game to read from. What we were going for with the branching dialogue is to have it where when you ask certain NPCs about certain topics, it will instigate a branching dialogue event that will progress the story in some way. What that means in technical terms is that the queue for the branching dialogue menu to be instanced as well as which conversation to run needed to be contained within the data for a response line. Now there already was some special formatting to the lines in the response files. You see these hashtags followed by numbers? Those aren't a part of the line. They mean when this line is shown, the topic of that index will be unlocked. So to see if you roll the branching dialogue events into this system, we finally made something I've been meaning to make for a while. A generic system for topic responses to call story functions, as we'll be calling them, which are predefined functions for special stuff like raising flags, changing global variables, and, well, instigating branching dialogue events. Here's the syntax we went with for the topic response file. And here's some bullshit for reading it in from the file. And yeah, I don't expect you to make sense of this. I don't really even know what's happening here. You can see in the main dialog menu's script, we made it where when it shows a topic response, the line's special function will be called if it exists. In this case, we're calling this function that instances the branching dialog menu and passes in which convo to use. But in the future we can make many more of these. At this point, we could access the test conversation from the main dialog menu as intended, but there were still a few issues. For one, the code for reading in these files was complete spaghetti, and I just sort of decided not to look at it before because it was working. The problem is, it keeps not working whenever I change anything, and it's a bitch to debug. I should really rethink it before this project becomes too bloated to even try. But that's just homework for me, and you don't really need to worry about it. The other issue, or I guess it's more just something I didn't think about, was that when you come back and ask about the same topic again, the conversation repeats, which might not make sense depending on the conversation or the context. One possible solution is to leave it to each conversation function to check whatever requirements and end the convo early if the convo shouldn't be happening. But then we're talking about instancing the entire menu and adding it to the scene tree just to delete it a frame later, which would be wasteful and weird. In the case of this game, the topic responses are static, so I think we can have all branching dialogue events be one time only to contrast. And the second time, it doesn't run the convo. The reason we pushed through on the visual scripting thing, even though it was giving us a hard time, rather than, say, making a custom conversation file type in editor, is because visual scripting is an actual part of the engine, so it has a lot of built-in flexibility. We can just change global variables or mess with the player's stats, or do just about anything without creating that functionality from scratch. But it's cleaner than manually writing all that branching in a text function. For example, this function makes the NPC hate the player, and the conversation can easily call it. Basically, we were getting the best of both worlds by leaving the hard programming and input-output to a GD script, while letting the visual script to do the freeform branching. What? This guy doesn't remember anything? Yeah, I totally don't have any idea why that would be. Am I a player? I don't know what you're talking about. Well, sucks to be you. Bye, B. And now he hates me. Oh, come on! You're being way too sensitive. Shit. Oh, what do I do? So there you go. It's basically just a menu instancing another menu, which then runs a coroutine from a visual script that in turn call functions from that same menu for the interfacing with the rest of the game. Simple, right? If you're trying to figure a similar system out, start by defining with specificity what you want and how it will fit into the rest of your game, and list what your options even are. Then it should become obvious which fits best with your needs. I probably would have just hard-coded the shit out of this if there were a game jam. If you're interested in this game, here's a playlist showing the progress up to this point. Also, let me know what you think of the shorter, more focused format.